Ryan Lope sat at the head of a long, polished table in the private dining room of an upscale New York City restaurant. The soft murmur of the city beyond was faint, muffled by the thick glass windows that framed the room. The air inside carried the rich aroma of gourmet dishes, meticulously crafted for Ryan and his guests. Around him, a group of business executives in expensive tailored suits laughed and toasted their success, discussing acquisitions, mergers, and strategies for future dominance. They talked about money, about owning the city, about winning. But none of it reached Ryan. His gaze fell to the glass of scotch in front of him, the amber liquid swirling slowly as he lifted it to his lips. The cold emptiness he'd felt for the last 2 decades gnawed at him, as present as the day it began. He was numb to the praise, to the success. His empire was vast, his power undeniable, but it all felt meaningless without Ellie. It had been 23 years since she'd been ripped from his life, and not a single day had passed where he hadn't felt her absence. The noise around him rose, laughter spilling from the men at the table as another deal was toasted. Ryan's phone buzzed on the table, but he didn't bother to check it. Another notification, another $1 million deal. It was all the same. Ryan, the voice cut through the haze of his thoughts, pulling him back to the present. His business partner, Mark, was grinning at him from across the table, raising his glass. "You should be celebrating. This acquisition, it's going to put us at the top of the game. We'll own more real estate in Manhattan than anyone." Ryan lifted his head, his face unreadable, offering only a faint nod. "Sure," he said, his voice flat. "Another win." Mark's smile faltered, confusion flickering in his eyes. "Come on, man. This is huge. Don't tell me you're not even going to toast to it." Ryan raised his glass out of obligation, clinking it against Mark's, though the taste of the scotch barely registered as he took a sip. "Cheers," he muttered, the word hollow. As the dinner began to wind down, and his guests trickled out, Ryan found himself standing alone by the window, staring down at the rain-slicked streets of New York. The city buzzed with life, a relentless energy that moved on without him. He was the architect of one of the most powerful real estate empires in the world, yet he felt like a ghost, disconnected from the world he had helped shape. He shrugged on his coat, ignoring the polite goodbyes of his colleagues, and stepped out into the night. The rain was steady, pattering on the pavement in a rhythm that mirrored the emptiness inside him. He didn't bother with an umbrella, letting the cold rain soak through his clothes as he walked aimlessly down the slick streets. The lights of the city reflected in the puddles, casting distorted shapes at his feet. Turning a corner, Ryan's eyes caught on a small figure huddled beneath a narrow awning. A young woman, barely in her 20s, clutched a baby close to her chest. Her clothes were soaked, her hair plastered to her face as she tried to shield the child from the rain. The baby whimpered softly, its tiny fists curling against her soaked jacket. Ryan slowed his pace, something tightening in his chest at the sight. There was a tenderness in the way the woman held the child, a familiarity that stirred a long-buried memory of Ellie. His feet faltered. The image of Ellie's warm smile and the life they had once dreamed of together filled his mind. Dreams that had died with her. Without thinking, Ryan reached into his pocket, pulling out a thick wad of cash. He approached the woman cautiously, his voice softer than he expected. "Here," he said, extending the money toward her. "Get something warm for the baby." The woman looked up, startled, her wide eyes filled with uncertainty. I can't take this," she stammered, her voice shaky. "Take it," Ryan insisted, his tone more urgent now. "For the baby." Hesitating for only a moment, the woman slowly reached out and accepted the money, her hands trembling. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick with exhaustion and gratitude. "I don't know how to repay you." "You don't have to," Ryan said, cutting her off. "Just make sure the baby's okay." They stood there in the rain, the city's noise distant, the world around them muted. The woman cradled the baby closer, her movements gentle and protective, while Ryan stood rooted in place, an unfamiliar warmth spreading through the cold void inside him. It was faint, but it was there, a flicker of something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. He turned to leave, his footsteps heavy on the wet pavement, but the image of the woman and her child lingered in his mind, a shadow of the life he had once imagined with Ellie. As he walked away, the rain continued to fall, but for the first time in years, he felt something other than emptiness. Mark's words from earlier that evening echoed in his mind. "This is going to cement your legacy." Ryan shook his head. He realized, with a clarity that cut deep, that the legacy he had built, the fortune, the skyscrapers, the power, meant nothing without love, without family. His true legacy had been lost the day Ellie was taken from him. And now, standing alone in the rain, he wondered if it was too late to find it again. The morning light streamed through the vast, floor-to-ceiling windows of Ryan Lopez's penthouse, casting long golden streaks across the minimalist decor. The city below buzzed with its usual urgency, but inside, all was quiet, too quiet. Ryan sat on the edge of his king-sized bed, staring blankly ahead, his thoughts clouded by memories of Ellie. Last night's strange encounter with the woman and her baby only deepened the ache that had never truly left him. It had been 23 years since Ellie's death, yet the pain was as raw as it had been the day she was taken from him. He moved through his morning routine mechanically. The cold water from the shower did little to stir him from the emotional fog, and the bitter black coffee tasted the same as every other morning. His life had become a well-oiled machine, highly efficient, meticulously controlled, but devoid of anything that mattered. His mind kept wandering back to the woman and her baby, standing in the rain. Why had she reminded him so much of Ellie? It wasn't her face. It was something deeper, something in the way she held her child with a tenderness that made his heart twist painfully in his chest. And the baby, the sight of that small, fragile life, made him feel something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in over 2 decades. Ryan dressed in one of his tailored suits, the fabric fitting perfectly over his broad shoulders, a testament to the life he had meticulously crafted for himself. He had spent years constructing this empire, piece by piece, but now, standing alone in the luxury of his penthouse, the success felt hollow. Once dressed, Ryan stepped out into the streets of New York, the world outside just as busy as it always was. But for Ryan, today was different. It was Sunday, a day that had become sacred to him in a way nothing else was anymore. Every Sunday, without fail, he visited Ellie's grave. The cemetery was a long drive from the heart of the city, nestled on the outskirts, far from the noise and chaos. Ryan's car, sleek and black, pulled up to the familiar iron gates, and he made his way through the rows of gravestones. Each step felt heavier as he approached Ellie's resting place. Her gravestone was simple and elegant, just like she had been in life. Ryan knelt down beside it, brushing away some fallen leaves. He sat in silence for a long time, letting the quiet of the cemetery wrap around him like a blanket. This was the only place where the rest of the world seemed to stop, where he could let himself feel the weight of his loss without interruption. "Hey, Ellie," Ryan whispered, his voice low, barely audible. "Another week. Another deal. Not that it matters." The wind rustled the nearby trees, and for a moment, Ryan allowed himself to imagine that she was still with him, that they could talk like they used to, about everything and nothing. But the silence was a brutal reminder that she was gone, and no amount of success or wealth could ever bring her back. As he stood to leave, something caught his eye. A figure stood at the far end of the cemetery, just at the edge of the path. Ryan's brow furrowed. It was the woman from last night, the young mother he had given the money to. She was standing there, cradling the baby in her arms, her eyes wide with the same surprise and confusion he felt. "You?" Ryan started, his voice trailing off as he took a step toward her. "What are you doing here?" The woman looked nervous, clutching her baby tighter as if seeking protection. "I didn't expect to see you," she said softly, glancing between him and the gravestone. Ryan's pulse quickened. "Why are you here?" he asked, a strange unease settling over him. "Who are you visiting?" The woman hesitated, biting her lip. I came to visit her," she finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. Ryan felt his stomach drop. "Who?" The woman took a deep breath, her gaze shifting to Ellie's gravestone. "Ellie," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I came to visit Ellie." Ryan stared at her, the world tilting on its axis. "You knew Ellie?" The woman nodded slowly, her expression filled with a mixture of fear and sadness. "I didn't know her personally," she admitted, "but she's my birth mother." Ryan's heart stopped. He took a step back, shaking his head as if trying to clear the fog of disbelief. "What are you talking about? Ellie never had a child." "I would have known." Tears welled up in the woman's eyes as she shifted the baby in her arms. "I was adopted," she explained, her voice shaking. "I only recently found out. Ellie was my birth mother." Ryan's mind reeled. He felt as though the ground was slipping out from under him. Ellie? A mother? It didn't make sense. She would have told him. She would have. "No," he said firmly, his voice tight. "This isn't possible. Ellie would have told me." The woman, Sadie, she said her name was, shook her head, her tears spilling over now. "I don't know why she didn't tell you," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I've been trying to understand it myself, but I have proof. I'm not lying." Ryan staggered back, his chest tight with confusion, anger, and a deep, gnawing pain. Sadie was claiming to be the daughter of the woman he had loved more than anything in the world, the daughter Ellie had kept a secret for more than 2 decades. He wanted to scream, to demand answers, but all he could do was stand there, numb, as the revelation shattered the fragile sense of peace he had built around himself. Everything he thought he knew about Ellie, about their life together, felt like it was crumbling away. "Why?" he managed to choke out, his voice raw. "Why didn't she tell me?" Sadie's gaze softened, and she held her baby close, as if finding comfort in the child's presence. "I don't know," she whispered. "I wish I did. But I think she was trying to protect you." Ryan shook his head, his heart pounding in his chest. He turned away, unable to face her any longer, the weight of the truth pressing down on him like a physical burden. He had come to the cemetery seeking solace, but instead, he had found the ghost of a life he never knew existed. And now, with the revelation hanging between them like a jagged wound, Ryan wondered if he could ever heal from this new, painful truth. The drive back from the cemetery was a blur. Ryan gripped the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles white as he navigated the streets of New York. His thoughts were scattered, his chest tight with emotions he didn't know how to process. Sadie's revelation had shaken him to his core. It was as if everything he had believed about Ellie, about their life together, was a lie. Ellie, the woman he had loved more than anything, had kept something from him. Not just something, someone. A daughter. Their daughter. The city lights streaked past his windows, a kaleidoscope of color and movement, but Ryan barely registered them. His mind was still at the cemetery, replaying the words Sadie had spoken. "I was adopted. Ellie was my birth mother." Ryan couldn't make sense of it. Ellie had never mentioned a child. She had never given him any indication that she had been pregnant, that she had made the decision to give up their daughter. It didn't add up. How could she have hidden something so monumental? Had their love meant so little to her that she could keep such a secret? By the time he reached his penthouse, Ryan felt as though he had been hollowed out. He pushed through the front door, tossed his keys onto the marble counter, and sank into the nearest chair. The luxury of his surroundings, the fine furniture, the priceless artwork, felt oppressive now, mocking him with their emptiness. They were symbols of the life he had built, a life that suddenly felt like a shell. Ryan leaned forward, resting his head in his hands. He had spent the better part of his adult life grieving Ellie, clinging to the belief that their love had been pure, that they had shared everything. Now, that belief was crumbling. Ellie had lied to him. She had made decisions that affected both of their lives, decisions he had no say in. A memory flooded back, unbidden. It was a conversation they had shared not long before her death. "Ryan," Ellie had said one evening, her voice soft as she stared out the window of their apartment. "Do you ever think about what our life would have been like if things had been different?" Ryan had looked up from his work, smiling at her. "Different? What do you mean?" Ellie had hesitated, her fingers tracing the edge of the blouse she was wearing. "I don't know. I guess I just wonder sometimes. You're always so busy. I wonder if you're truly happy." Ryan had crossed the room to her, cupping her face in his hands. "Ellie, of course I'm happy. I have you. The rest of it, business, success, it doesn't matter compared to you." Ellie had smiled, but there had been something in her eyes, a flicker of something Ryan hadn't noticed at the time. Was it regret? Fear? He hadn't thought to ask. He had been too caught up in the moment, too sure that their love was unbreakable. Now, sitting alone in his penthouse, Ryan realized what that look had been. Ellie had been hiding something. Even then, she had been carrying the weight of her decision, her secret, and he had been too blind to see it. Ryan slammed his fist down onto the table, the sound reverberating through the quiet room. How could he have missed it? How had he not known? His entire life felt like a lie, a series of illusions he had built to protect himself from the truth. The sharp ring of his phone interrupted his thoughts. Ryan glanced at the screen, his heart skipping a beat when he saw the name. Sadie. For a moment, he hesitated. He wasn't ready to talk to her. He wasn't ready to face the truth she had brought into his life. But something inside him urged him to pick up, to hear her out. Slowly, he answered. "Sadie," he said, his voice rough. "What do you want?" There was a long pause on the other end, the silence stretching between them. Finally, Sadie spoke, her voice soft. "I wanted to check on you. After what I told you. I know it's a lot to process." Ryan let out a bitter laugh, rubbing his temples. "A lot to process. You think?" His voice cracked with frustration. "You dropped a bombshell on me, Sadie. You told me that the woman I loved for most of my life had a daughter she never told me about." "I know," Sadie said quietly. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to hurt you." Ryan's jaw tightened. Why didn't she tell me, Sadie? Why would she keep this from me? Sadie was silent for a moment before she spoke again. "I don't know. I've been asking myself the same thing ever since I found out. Maybe she was scared. Maybe she thought you were too focused on your business to want a child." Ryan's breath caught in his throat. The words stung because they were true. Hadn't Ellie expressed that same fear years ago? Hadn't she hinted at the possibility that he had been too consumed by his ambition to see what was happening right in front of him? He sighed, leaning back in his chair. "I would have wanted her, Sadie. I would have been there." Sadie's voice was gentle, but there was a note of skepticism. "Would you? Would you have been there, Ryan? Or would you have buried yourself in your work, like you did with Ellie?" Ryan's chest tightened painfully. He didn't have an answer to that. He didn't know what he would have done if he had known about Sadie all those years ago. But he knew one thing for sure. He hadn't been given the chance to find out. "I don't know," he admitted, his voice barely more than a whisper. "All I know is that I wasn't given a choice." Sadie was quiet for a long time, the weight of her words hanging in the air. "You're right. You weren't. But now you have a choice. I'm here, and Damien, he's your grandson. Whether you like it or not, we're connected." Ryan swallowed hard, the reality of what she was saying finally sinking in. Damien, his grandson. The thought had barely registered in the chaos of learning about Sadie, but now it hit him like a wave. He had missed out on being a father, but there was still time to be a grandfather. "Why didn't you come sooner?" Ryan asked, his voice breaking slightly. "Why didn't you come to me when you first found out?" "I was scared," Sadie admitted, her voice trembling. "I didn't know how you'd react. I didn't want to ruin your life, and I wasn't sure if you'd even want me. But I had to know. I had to know who you were." Ryan's heart ached as he listened to her. She had been lost, just as he had been. They had both been searching for answers, for something to fill the void left by Ellie's absence. And now, they were both standing at the edge of a truth that neither of them had been prepared for. "What do I do now?" Ryan asked, his voice full of uncertainty. Sadie was quiet for a moment before responding. "You don't have to do anything right now. Just think about it. I'm not here to force myself into your life. I just wanted to know where I came from. And maybe we can figure the rest out together." Ryan closed his eyes, the weight of the shattered illusions pressing down on him. Everything he had believed about Ellie, about their life together, had been fractured. But amidst the wreckage, there was a glimmer of hope, a chance to rebuild, not with Ellie, but with the family she had left behind. "I'll think about it," Ryan finally said, his voice low. "But I need time." "I understand," Sadie replied softly. "Take all the time you need." They hung up, and Ryan sat in the darkened room, staring out at the city skyline. The weight of Sadie's revelation was still heavy on his heart, but beneath the pain there was something new stirring, a sense of possibility he hadn't felt in years. Ryan lay awake in the dim glow of his penthouse, staring at the ceiling. The hours had bled into one another, but sleep remained elusive. Sadie's revelation circled endlessly in his mind, dragging him through a whirlwind of emotions: anger, confusion, sorrow. The image of Ellie, the woman he had loved so deeply, was now tainted by secrets and unanswered questions. Why had she kept Sadie from him? Why had she chosen to hide such a monumental part of their lives? Ryan tossed and turned, but no answer came. His mind was trapped in a loop, playing over the years they had spent together, searching for signs, for something that could explain the choices she had made. By the early morning, Ryan couldn't stand it anymore. He needed answers, something that would help him understand why Ellie had done what she had. There had to be something she had left behind. A letter, a journal, anything that could shed light on her decision. The woman he had loved couldn't have kept this secret without reason. There had to be an explanation, and Ryan was determined to find it. He sat at his kitchen table, his coffee growing cold as he stared at his phone. There were a few paths he could take. He could call his lawyer, inquire about any undisclosed documents Ellie might have left behind, or he could visit their old home, the one they had shared together before her death. It had been sold years ago, but perhaps the new owners had found something in the attic, a box or a collection of personal belongings Ellie hadn't taken with her. But as Ryan considered his options, one name came to mind: Helen. Helen had been more than just a family friend to Ellie. She had been like a second mother. Ryan remembered how Ellie had often turned to her for advice, how the two had shared a bond that he had never fully understood. If anyone had answers, it would be her. Later that morning, Ryan arrived in a quiet neighborhood outside the city, where Helen still lived in the same small house where she had raised her children. The walk up to her door was heavier than Ryan had expected. His heart raced, a mix of hope and dread churning inside him as he knocked. The door creaked open, revealing Helen, a woman in her late 60s, her face lined with the kindness and wisdom of years. Her eyes softened as she saw Ryan. "Ryan," she said quietly, stepping aside to let him in. "It's been a long time." Ryan nodded, stepping into the warm, familiar home. The living room hadn't changed much over the years. Photographs of Helen's children and grandchildren lined the walls, and there in the corner were pictures of Ellie. Ellie as a child, Ellie on her wedding day, and one of Ryan and Ellie together, beaming at the camera. They sat down in the small, cozy living room. Helen poured them both tea, the routine act feeling oddly comforting amidst the storm of emotions swirling inside Ryan. "I know why you're here," Helen said after a long moment, her voice steady but sad. "Sadie came to see me a few months ago." Ryan's heart skipped a beat. She did. Helen nodded, setting her cup down with a soft clink. She wanted to know about Ellie. She was looking for answers, just like you are now. Ryan leaned forward, his voice tight with urgency. Helen, why didn't Ellie tell me? Why would she keep something like this from me? Helen sighed, her eyes filled with a mixture of sorrow and understanding. Ryan, Ellie was scared. She was young when she found out she was pregnant, and at the time, you were so focused on building your business. She felt like she couldn't tell you, like it would derail everything you were working toward. Ryan clenched his fists, frustration boiling inside him. I would have been there for her, Helen. I would have wanted to know. She didn't give me a choice. Helen looked at him gently. I know, but Ellie didn't make that decision lightly. She was terrified of losing you. She was afraid that if she told you, it would change everything between you. Ryan stood abruptly, pacing the room. So she just gave our daughter away. She gave her up without even telling me. How could she do that? Helen watched him quietly, her voice soft when she finally spoke. Ellie thought she was doing what was best for everyone. She loved you, Ryan, but she didn't think you were ready for a child. She was young, and you were on the cusp of something huge with your company. She thought the timing was all wrong. Ryan stopped pacing, his chest tight with grief and anger. She should have told me. She should have trusted me. Helen nodded. You're right. She should have. But she was afraid, and she made a decision based on that fear. She didn't want to lose you. Ryan sank back into his chair, the weight of Helen's words pressing down on him. Ellie had been scared. She had made a choice out of fear. And now, years later, Ryan was left to deal with the consequences of that choice. Does Sadie know all of this? Ryan asked quietly. Helen shook her head. No, she doesn't know the full story. All she knows is that Ellie was her birth mother and that she was adopted. She came to me, looking for answers, but I didn't tell her everything. I figured it wasn't my place. Ryan swallowed hard. Did Ellie leave anything behind? Anything that might explain why she made the decisions she did? Helen paused, thinking. There is something. Ellie kept a journal during those months. She wrote about everything, her fears, her thoughts about the pregnancy. I kept it, thinking that maybe one day you'd want to read it. Ryan's heart pounded in his chest. A journal. Ellie's thoughts, her words from that time. Perhaps that was where the answers were. Perhaps, in her own words, she had left behind the explanation Ryan so desperately needed. Helen stood and disappeared into the back room. When she returned, she held a small, leather-bound journal in her hands, worn with age. She handed it to Ryan, her eyes full of sympathy. Be gentle with her, Ryan. She loved you more than you'll ever know. Ryan took the journal, his hands trembling slightly as he ran his fingers over the worn cover. It felt fragile, like holding a piece of Ellie's soul, a part of her he had never known, but was now about to discover. That night, back in his penthouse, Ryan sat at his desk, the journal lying in front of him like a doorway to the past. The city lights flickered outside the window, casting a soft glow over the room. With a deep breath, he opened the journal to the first page. Ellie's handwriting stared back at him, neat, delicate, familiar. December 14th. I'm pregnant. I don't know how to feel. I love Ryan, but he's so busy with work. I'm scared to tell him. What if he doesn't want this? What if he doesn't want me anymore? Ryan's heart clenched as he read the words. Ellie had been scared, terrified, even. She hadn't known how to tell him, hadn't known how he would react. She had been alone in her fear. As Ryan continued reading, the entries revealed more of Ellie's inner turmoil. She wrote about her growing distance from Ryan, how his business was consuming more of his time, leaving her feeling more alone with each passing day. She had wrestled with the decision to keep the baby, to tell him, but the fear of losing him had won out. Tears welled in Ryan's eyes as he read entry after entry, Ellie's words piercing him like a knife. She had been so scared, so unsure. She hadn't hidden Sadie from him out of malice. She had been trying to protect him, to protect what they had. He closed the journal, unable to read more. The weight of her choices pressed down on him like a boulder, but amidst the pain, there was a flicker of understanding. Ellie had been human, flawed, just like him. She had loved him, even as she made decisions he couldn't understand. Ryan picked up his phone, his fingers trembling as he dialed Sadie's number. "Sadie," he said quietly when she answered. "I've been reading Ellie's journal. I think I understand now. Can we talk?" There was a pause on the other end before Sadie replied, her voice soft and full of emotion. "I'd like that." And for the first time in years, Ryan felt a glimmer of hope, a chance for healing, a chance to rebuild. Ryan sat in the dimly lit living room of his penthouse, Ellie's journal resting on his lap. The soft hum of the city outside his windows filled the quiet space, but inside, all he could hear were the echoes of Ellie's words. Her thoughts, her fears, her love. They had all been captured in the delicate handwriting that now revealed the truth he had never known. He had spent the last few hours reading, carefully turning each page as if the paper might disintegrate beneath his fingers. The journal had become both a lifeline and a burden. Each entry was another step into the past, another glimpse into Ellie's heart, a heart that had been full of conflict, love, and ultimately, fear. December 14th. "I'm pregnant." The words kept repeating in his mind. Ellie had known she was pregnant, had written about it, yet she had never told him. She had carried the weight of that secret for months, struggling with the decision of whether or not to tell him. Ryan couldn't help but wonder how differently things might have turned out if she had shared the news with him. Would their relationship have survived? Would they have raised Sadie together? Or would his work and ambition have driven them apart regardless? He turned to the next page, his heart heavy. January 3rd. "I can't do this alone, but I don't know how to tell him. He's so distant these days, always working. I barely see him, every time I try to bring it up. The words get stuck in my throat. What if he doesn't want this baby? What if he doesn't want me anymore?" Ryan closed his eyes, the pain of Ellie's words hitting him harder than any blow. He had been so wrapped up in his business, so focused on building his empire, that he had failed to notice the distance growing between them. He had missed the signs, the small ways she had tried to reach out to him. And now, reading her thoughts, he could see the cracks in their relationship that had been there all along, cracks he had been too blind to see. His phone buzzed softly on the table, pulling him from his thoughts. It was a message from Sadie. "I'm ready whenever you are." Ryan's heart skipped a beat. He hadn't expected her to reach out so soon, but something in the journal, something in Ellie's words, had shifted things for him. He needed to talk to Sadie, to begin the process of healing, both for himself and for the family they had never known they were. With a deep breath, he sent a reply. "Come by the apartment. We need to talk." Sadie arrived an hour later, her face a mixture of nervousness and determination. She was holding a small box, her hands trembling slightly as she entered the penthouse. Ryan led her into the living room, gesturing for her to sit on the couch. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The tension in the air was thick, filled with unspoken words and unanswered questions. Finally, Ryan broke the silence. "I've been reading Ellie's journal," he said, his voice quiet. "There's so much I didn't know, so much she kept from me." Sadie looked down at the box in her hands, her fingers tracing the edges. "I know," she replied softly. "I've been trying to piece it all together myself. I found some things, too. Letters. Letters she wrote but never sent." Ryan's heart clenched. Letters. Ellie had written letters to Sadie, letters she had never intended to send. He watched as Sadie opened the box and carefully pulled out a bundle of yellowed paper, tied together with a faded ribbon. "These are the letters," Sadie said, her voice trembling. "I found them after I learned the truth about who she was." Ryan reached for the letters, his hands shaking slightly as he untied the ribbon. He unfolded the first letter. Ellie's handwriting once again staring back at him. But this time, The words were for Sadie. Dear Sadie, I don't know if you'll ever read this, but I hope you do. I hope you understand why I made the choices I did. Giving you up was the hardest thing I've ever done, but I did it because I thought it was best for you. I loved you then, and I love you now. Not a day goes by that I don't think of you, and I hope wherever you are, you're happy. Ryan felt a lump form in his throat as he read the letter. Ellie's words were filled with pain, with the heartbreak of a mother who had made an impossible choice. She had loved Sadie, had carried that love with her for all those years, even as she kept it hidden from Ryan. Sadie watched him quietly, her eyes filled with tears. She wanted me to find these one day, she said. I think she always hoped I'd understand, even if she couldn't tell me herself. Ryan nodded, his voice tight with emotion. She loved you, he whispered. She always loved you. For a long moment, they sat in silence, the weight of Ellie's choices pressing down on them both. Sadie wiped at her eyes, her expression a mix of sadness and acceptance. I don't know if I can ever forgive her, Sadie said quietly. She made that decision for both of us, without giving us a say. Ryan looked down at the letters in his hands, his heart heavy with the same conflict. He understood Sadie's pain. He shared it. But he also understood Ellie's fear. She thought she was protecting us, he said softly. But that doesn't make it any easier. Sadie nodded, her eyes full of unshed tears. No, it doesn't. They spent the next hour going through the letters, reading each one aloud. Some were short, others long, but they all carried the same message. Ellie had loved Sadie, had never stopped loving her, even as she made the hardest decision of her life. By the end, the letters felt like a bridge, a fragile, delicate connection between the mother Sadie had never known and the daughter Ellie had left behind. When they had finished, Ryan leaned back in his chair, his heart heavy but somehow lighter. There's something I need to tell you, Sadie, he said. Something Ellie wrote in her journal. Sadie looked at him, her expression curious but wary. She was scared, Sadie. She didn't keep you from me out of spite or indifference. She was terrified of losing me, of losing what we had. She thought if she told me about you, it would destroy everything. Sadie's brow furrowed, and she looked down at her hands. But she didn't give you a chance to decide. She didn't trust you enough to tell you the truth. Ryan nodded, the truth of her words stinging. I know. But I think she was trying to protect us both. She didn't want to risk losing either of us. Sadie was quiet for a moment before she spoke again, her voice barely above a whisper. Do you think she regretted it? Giving me up? Ryan thought of Ellie's journal, of the pain and love that had filled every page. I think she did, he said softly. She might not have said it outright, but I think she carried that regret with her every day. Sadie wiped at her eyes again, nodding slowly. I wish I could have known her. I wish she could have told me herself. Ryan placed a hand on her shoulder, his touch gentle. You're getting to know her now. Through her words, her letters. It's not the same, but it's something. Sadie looked at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of grief and gratitude. I guess it is. As the evening wore on, they talked about Ellie, about the woman she had been, the choices she had made, and the legacy she had left behind. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't painless, but it was a start to healing, to understanding, to building something new out of the pieces Ellie had left them. Later that night, after Sadie had left, Ryan sat alone in his living room, Ellie's journal still open on his lap. He turned to the last few pages, reading her final thoughts, her final confessions. Ryan, if you're reading this, please know that I never meant to hurt you. I thought I was doing the right thing, but now I see that I was wrong. I'm sorry for all the pain I've caused. I loved you then, and I always will. Tears blurred Ryan's vision as he closed the journal. Ellie's words echoed in his mind, filling him with a deep, aching sadness. But beneath that sadness, there was something else, something softer, gentler. It was understanding. It was forgiveness. And for the first time in years, Ryan felt as though he could finally begin to heal. The next few days felt like a blur of revelations and reflection. Ryan found himself lost in thought more often than not, replaying the words from Ellie's journal and Sadie's letters. He hadn't realized how deeply her choices had affected him until now, how much of his life had been shaped by a lie he hadn't known existed. Yet now that the truth was out, it wasn't the destruction he had feared. Instead, it felt like the beginning of something new, something fragile but hopeful. One afternoon, Ryan found himself walking through Central Park, the autumn leaves crunching beneath his feet as he wandered the tree-lined paths. The air was crisp, the sky a brilliant blue, and for the first time in a long while, he felt a sense of clarity. The ghosts of the past were still with him, but they didn't weigh as heavily on his shoulders. He had read Ellie's words, had begun to understand her choices, and most importantly, had begun to build a bridge with Sadie. Ryan's thoughts often turned to her these days. She was more than just a connection to Ellie's past. She was a person, a daughter, and a mother. And though they had started off as strangers, they were slowly learning how to navigate the complicated relationship between them. He wasn't sure what the future held, but for the first time, he felt open to the possibilities. As he walked through the park, his phone buzzed in his pocket. It was Sadie. He hesitated for only a moment before answering. "Hey," he said, his voice calm. "Hey," Sadie replied, her tone lighter than it had been during their previous conversations. "I was wondering if you're free this afternoon. I'd like to meet up." Ryan's heart skipped a beat, but he kept his voice steady. "Yeah, I'm free. Where do you want to meet?" Sadie paused for a moment. "There's a cafe near the park. It's small, but it's nice. I thought we could talk there." Ryan agreed, and after a few more minutes of walking, he made his way to the cafe Sadie had suggested. It was a quiet spot, tucked away from the main streets, with large windows that looked out onto the park. When he arrived, Sadie was already there, sitting by the window with a cup of tea in front of her. She looked up as he entered, offering a small, tentative smile. "Hey," she said softly as he sat down across from her. "Thanks for coming." "Of course," Ryan replied. "I'm glad you called." They sat in silence for a moment, the quiet hum of the cafe filling the space between them. There was still a heaviness to their conversations, but it was different now. It wasn't the awkwardness of strangers or the tension of unresolved anger. It was the weight of two people trying to figure out where they fit in each other's lives. "I've been thinking a lot," Sadie began, stirring her tea absently. "About everything. About Ellie. About you. And about Damien." Ryan felt his chest tighten at the mention of his grandson. He hadn't spent much time with Damien yet, hadn't even fully processed what it meant to be a grandfather, but the thought of him stirred something deep inside. "I want you to meet him," Sadie said suddenly, her voice filled with a mixture of hope and uncertainty. "I mean, really meet him. I think it's important. For both of you." Ryan blinked, caught off guard by the suddenness of the request. "You want me to meet him?" Sadie nodded, her hands gripping the edge of the table. "I know it's a lot to ask, but I think it could be good for him to know his grandfather. And I think it could be good for you too." Ryan's mind raced. He had imagined this moment, meeting Damien, but he hadn't expected it to come so soon. Part of him was terrified. What if he wasn't ready? What if he didn't know how to be a good grandfather? But another part of him, the part that had been longing for connection, knew that this was a step he needed to take. "Okay," he said softly, his voice steady. "I'd like that." Sadie's face lit up with relief, and for the first time, Ryan saw a glimpse of the woman she was outside of all the grief and pain they had shared. She was strong, resilient, and deeply caring. It was clear that she wanted what was best for Damien, and Ryan realized that he did too. "When do you want to do it?" Ryan asked. "Tomorrow," Sadie replied, her eyes brightening. "We could meet at the park, somewhere open where Damien can run around." Ryan nodded, feeling a mixture of excitement and apprehension. Tomorrow. He would meet his grandson tomorrow. The thought filled him with a strange kind of nervousness, but also with hope. The next day, Ryan arrived at the park earlier than planned, his hands shoved deep into his pockets as he tried to calm the flutter of nerves in his chest. It was a warm autumn day, and the park was filled with families, children playing on the grass, couples walking hand in hand. It was a peaceful scene, but for Ryan, it felt like the beginning of something monumental. When Sadie arrived, Damien was with her, a small, energetic boy with wide eyes and an infectious laugh. He was running ahead of her, his little legs carrying him across the grass with surprising speed. Sadie waved at Ryan as she approached, and Damien followed her gaze, slowing down when he saw the man standing near the bench. "Hi," Ryan said, his voice a little unsteady as he knelt down to Damien's level. "You must be Damien." The boy looked up at him, his eyes curious but not shy. "Hi," he said simply, his voice soft, but full of the innocence of childhood. Ryan smiled, though his heart was pounding in his chest. He didn't know what to expect, didn't know how to act around a child, let alone his grandson. But as he looked into Damien's eyes, he felt something shift inside him, a connection, a sense of responsibility, and most of all, a sense of love. Damien seemed to sense it too, because after a moment, he smiled back at Ryan, a smile so full of warmth and trust that it nearly brought tears to Ryan's eyes. "Do you want to play?" Damien asked, holding up a small soccer ball that he had been carrying. Ryan chuckled, nodding. "Sure, I'd love to." For the next hour, Ryan found himself running around the park with Damien, kicking the ball back and forth, laughing as the boy's energy seemed boundless. Sadie watched from the bench, her face soft with emotion as she saw her father and son bonding for the first time. It wasn't perfect, it wasn't easy, but it was real. By the time they sat down to rest, Damien was tired, his small body leaning against Ryan as they sat on the grass. Ryan looked down at him, his heart full. "I think we should do this again," Ryan said, glancing over at Sadie. Sadie smiled, her eyes filled with gratitude. "I think so too." And in that moment, Ryan realized that the first steps toward healing had already been taken. It wasn't just about forgiving Ellie, or even understanding the choices she had made. It was about building something new, something that could bring joy, connection, and love back into their lives. It was a beginning, and for the first time in a long time, Ryan felt ready to take the next step. Several months had passed since Ryan first met his grandson, Damien. The once tentative relationship between Ryan and Sadie had grown stronger with each encounter, each conversation. And with every passing day, Ryan began to feel something he hadn't experienced in years, a sense of purpose, a renewed sense of belonging. The shadows of the past were still there, but they no longer consumed him. Instead, they had become part of a larger, more complex picture, one in which Ryan was no longer alone. Today was a particularly significant day. Sadie had planned something special, an event to celebrate new beginnings, both for their small family and the community of people who had experienced similar stories of loss, adoption, and reconciliation. It was Sadie's idea, of course. She had a gift for bringing people together, for turning pain into something meaningful. The event was being held at a local community center, and they had spent weeks preparing for it. Ryan stood in front of the mirror in his apartment, adjusting his tie. He looked at his reflection, the man staring back at him, both familiar and different. He had aged, yes, but there was something in his eyes now that hadn't been there before. A softness, a quiet strength. He had come to terms with Ellie's choices, with the secrets she had kept, and though the pain of losing her still lingered, it no longer defined him. He had found something new, something that felt like a second chance. As he left his apartment and headed to the community center, Ryan's thoughts drifted to Ellie. He wondered what she would think if she could see them now. Him, Sadie, and Damien. Would she be proud? Would she be relieved to know that they had found each other, despite everything? Ryan liked to think she would be. In many ways, this event felt like a tribute to her, to the love she had carried for both of them. even if it had been hidden away for so many years. When Ryan arrived at the community center, the hall was already filling with people. The space had been transformed. Round tables draped in simple white cloths, soft lighting casting a warm glow over the room. There were photos on the walls, images of families, of reunions, of love. In one corner, a small stage had been set up for the speakers. It was intimate, welcoming, exactly the kind of atmosphere Sadie had envisioned. Sadie greeted him at the door, her eyes lighting up when she saw him. "You made it," she said, her smile wide. Ryan nodded, his heart swelling with pride as he looked at her. "I wouldn't miss it for the world." She hugged him tightly, something they had only started doing in recent weeks. The first time had felt awkward, but now it was natural, like a small but important step in their evolving relationship. "Are you ready?" Sadie asked, pulling back slightly to look at him. Ryan chuckled softly, shaking his head. "Not at all. But I'm here." Sadie laughed, her nerves evident but overshadowed by her excitement. "It'll be great. You'll see." As the event began, Ryan found a seat near the front, watching as Sadie took the stage to welcome everyone. She looked confident, poised, her voice steady as she spoke about the importance of family, of connection, and of healing. She talked about her journey of discovering her birth mother, about the challenges of reconciling the past with the present. But most of all, she talked about the future, about hope. Ryan listened, his heart full. He hadn't expected to feel this way, so deeply moved by the words of his daughter, a woman he had only recently come to know. But as she spoke, he realized just how much she had grown, how much they both had grown. After Sadie finished her speech, there was a panel discussion with other speakers, people who had experienced adoption, family reunions, and the complexities of navigating those relationships. The room was filled with stories of love, loss, and resilience, each one a reminder of the power of human connection. When the discussion ended, people mingled, talking and sharing their own experiences. Ryan found himself in conversations with several attendees, some who had been adopted, others who had given up children, and still others who were trying to reconnect with lost family members. It was humbling, and for the first time in a long while, Ryan felt like he was part of something larger than himself. Toward the end of the evening, Ryan stepped outside for a moment, needing a breath of fresh air. The sky was dark now, the stars faint but visible in the city's glow. As he stood there, looking up at the night sky, Sadie joined him, standing beside him in comfortable silence. "You did a good thing here," Ryan said softly, glancing over at her. "I'm proud of you." Sadie smiled, a touch of emotion in her eyes. "I couldn't have done it without you." Ryan shook his head. "No, this was all you. You brought us together. You've given us something I didn't even know we needed." Sadie looked down for a moment, her expression thoughtful. "I've been thinking a lot about Ellie," she said quietly, "about her legacy. And I realized something. Her legacy isn't just in the choices she made or the secrets she kept. It's in us, in you, in me, and in Damien. We're her legacy. And we're building something new now, something better." Ryan's chest tightened with emotion, and he nodded, his voice thick as he spoke. "You're right. We are her legacy. And I think she'd be proud of what we're doing." Sadie smiled, wiping at her eyes. "I like to think so too." They stood there for a moment, side by side, looking out at the night. The weight of the past still lingered, but it no longer felt like a burden. Instead, it felt like a foundation, one that they were building on together, brick by brick, with every conversation, every shared moment, every step forward. When they finally went back inside, Damien ran up to them, his face beaming with joy. "Grandpa, look what I made," he said, holding up a drawing he had colored during the event. Ryan knelt down, smiling as he took the drawing from Damien's hands. It was a simple picture, a house, a sun, and 3 figures standing together. Ryan, Sadie, and Damien. "It's perfect," Ryan said, his voice filled with pride as he looked into Damien's eyes. "You did a great job, buddy." Damien grinned, clearly pleased with himself. "Can we hang it up?" Ryan nodded. "Absolutely. We'll find the perfect spot for it." As the evening came to a close, Ryan felt a deep sense of peace settle over him. The journey had been long and painful, but it had brought him to a place he hadn't thought possible, a place of healing, of connection, of love. He had lost Ellie, yes, but he had gained something too. He had found Sadie and Damien. He had found family. And as they left the community center that night, walking together into the cool autumn air, Ryan knew that this was only the beginning. They had taken the first steps toward building a new legacy, one that would honor the past, but also look forward to the future. And for the first time in years, Ryan felt a profound sense of hope, not just for himself, but for the family he had found, and for the legacy they were creating together.